and let's get started. So, Introduction to Sociology, Chapter 1, Sociology and the Real World. So, what is sociology? Well, when we talk about sociology, we're talking about the systemic or scientific study of human society, of social behavior. We're looking at large-scale institutions and mass culture, aka popular culture or pop culture, to small groups and individual interactions. So what does that essentially mean if we're pulling ourselves away from the textbook definition of sociology? As sociologists, we're concerned about social interaction, social behavior, how I respond to you, how you respond to me, the impact of culture in shaping our social interactions with others, as well as developing our sense of self, our own identity. And we're going to discuss that later on in future chapters as we progress through these lectures. But just keep that in mind. We can argue that sociology is the study of society, how society works. Why does Coca-Cola offer certain marketing campaigns? Why do certain sports teams offer certain campaigns for free gifts or community outreach? Why do they engage in these behaviors? When you and I are talking face to face, why might you refer to me as A, B, or C, and why might I refer to you as A, B, or C? This idea that we've been socialized, and we'll hear that term throughout this entire semester, how we've been taught to interact with one another. The socialization process begins to shape what we call our understanding of the social world. Now, later on in a few chapters, we'll be discussing society. But what is society? Well, society is essentially a group of people whose lives are shaped by patterned ways of thinking that are framed by culture. And so I want you to take that into consideration. Think about the society you live in, the culture of the United States, the culture of your individual city, the culture of your family, and how all of that has contributed to your understanding of the world. And in addition to that, your understanding of yourself and how you navigate the waters of the social world. Now, let's break it down even simpler. What is sociology? Essentially, the study of people doing things together, right? Coexisting with one another. And when we start to think about sociology, we need to understand that naturally, human beings are social beings, that we don't live in isolation. Because if we lived in isolation from the point of birth to the point of death, we would never understand who we are. We would never understand our sense of self. And in addition to that, what you want to take into consideration is the fact that as we start to navigate through the social world, well, we need individuals to teach us how to navigate. We need individuals to help us grow. Now, when we start to look at how do we survive as human beings, how do we begin to adopt this concept of being a social being? What we want to take into consideration is that our membership in groups is incredibly powerful. From our family to our neighborhoods to the group of friends that we hang out with, perhaps when we were in middle school or high school, right? And now college. All those shape who you become, and all of those shape your perspective of the social world. Now, what we as sociologists hope to accomplish is that we want to begin to understand how human beings affect society and how society affects human beings. Now, you might be thinking, well, what exactly does that mean? So let me give you an example. Over the last few weeks, month or so, we've seen a lot of active participation in the Black Lives Matter movements. The Black Lives Matter movement is a collection of individuals who are striving to bring about criminal justice reform and a variety of other topics, but we'll focus on criminal justice reform. Well, at this level, this individualized level, this smaller scale level, individuals are beginning to change larger social institutions, such as the criminal justice system or law enforcement agencies. and how they police communities, from changing policies related to chokeholds to changing policies related to diversity training. Those are how humans or individuals begin to affect larger society. And then when we look at how larger society begins to affect human beings, well, think about advertising or branding on social media, advertising or branding in commercials, right? Celebrity endorsements of products to get us to say, hey, I want the latest and the greatest, right? How that begins to shape your spending behaviors, how that begins to shape the social hierarchies that are established in society. And for example, the brand of clothing we wear, right? What's the difference between a basic no-name purse, a Michael Kors purse, and a Louis Vuitton purse? Well, someone had to create that demand. Someone had to say that the Louis Vuitton purse was worth $1,000 or more. Well, that's how society or branding of large institutions begins to affect human beings on an individual level. Now, let's look at the sociological perspective. And what I want everyone to do, and you don't have to literally do it, but at least in your minds, please do it. Put on your sociological lenses, these imaginary glasses that you're going to wear as you start to adopt the philosophy and the mentality of a sociologist. What the sociological perspective essentially says is go into situations with a beginner's mindset. And what does that mean? Well, essentially go into situations as a blank canvas. Unlearn everything that you already know, suspend any prejudices that you may have, and allow the situation to paint that canvas, to add color and texture to that canvas. It's a challenge for many of us because we've grown up in a world, we've been socialized in a world that tells us you have to do it A, B, and C ways. We've been socialized in a culture that has shaped our thoughts and our beliefs about groups of individuals, about how we should live our life. And the sociological perspective says, I know it's a challenge, but I need you to suspend all of that and approach life as a blank canvas, right? And see what type of painting is painted or what type of image appears. Now, with this beginner's mind, right, it challenges us to discover new things, to change our habitual way of thinking, to be present in the moment. And that's incredibly powerful. And here's the reason why it's incredibly powerful. When we start to look at how we navigate through our social world, think about people's behaviors at concerts or sporting events. Think about people's behaviors on the 4th of July. How many of us are actually living present in the moment? And how many of us are hiding behind our cell phones, taking pictures and taking film of everything that we're seeing? The sociological perspective through this beginner's mind is saying, put down that cell phone, right? Put down that cell phone and text messaging for just a minute and understand everything that's going on around you. We want you to fully participate in the realities of the situation. Now, in addition to that, let's go a step further. What makes a sociologist? Well, a sociologist is essentially someone who has this passion and this interest in human affairs, someone who has this intense curiosity in the pursuit of knowledge. As we progress through this class, what you're going to notice is that in many ways, we're not only going to challenge conventional ways of thinking, but we're also going to begin to shape our critical thinking abilities. As I tell my students, being a sociologist will drive you nuts. And the reason it'll drive you nuts is because you begin to analyze every new social situation that you're involved in, from day-to-day interactions with someone to even watching a movie and breaking down the contents of that film. So you want to keep that in mind as we progress through this class, that your mindset's going to begin to be shaped. And you're going to start thinking, wow, I wonder why that occurs. And there's nothing wrong with asking why or how. It's part of our development as thinkers, our development as innovators, our development as leaders. Now, at times, we may be shocked by what we hear. We're all young. I'm 34 years old. I don't truly understand the prejudice and the racism that existed prior to the civil rights movements, right? Because I grew up in an era where, although we have plenty of room for improvement in reference to civil rights and equality and equity in our society, it is not as bad as it was during the Jim Crow era. That being said, imagine if I was able to go into a time machine, right, with this 21st century perspective of the social world, of what it means to have rights and civil rights in America, and I go back to 1930. I would be experiencing a culture shock, seeing signs that don't welcome me into their businesses as a Mexican American, right? Seeing governmental policies that say, well, yeah, there's 2 water fountains. Yes, there are 2 bathrooms, but you could only use bathroom A. You could only drink from bathroom A. I want you to take that into consideration, because with every new life experience, we begin to experience this culture shock, right? This sense of disorientation that may exist when we start to enter radically new social or cultural environments. I'm going to share with you a story. I think it was in November. I went to Vegas, and I'm a huge Boise State football fan. And I went to the Boise State versus the University of Washington football game. It was a bowl game. And I'm a fan of Washington as well. But I go to the game, and I've gone to Boise State games before in Vegas, and it's usually people cheering for UNLV, the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, a very diverse crowd. I go to the Boise game, I'm sitting on the Boise State side. And as I'm walking up the steps to my seat, I see nothing but MAGA hats. Make America Great. I see Make America Great hats, the red hats. I see Make America Great camouflage t-shirts. I see some t-shirts with like Donald Trump with a 6-pack holding the American flag. And that was a cultural shock, right? I'm sitting there, and the whole time, unrelated to football, the individual sitting behind me is making comments about liberals and how colleges are ruining students and all this type of nonsense. Well, that offers a cultural shock. If any of you have traveled outside of the state of California to less diverse states, there will be a cultural shock there too. I lived in Georgia for a while in the South. Right? I've traveled through Alabama. Right? You don't even have to go to the South. You could go to Arizona. You can go to the rural parts of Nevada and feel like an outsider. That provides culture shock, a level of discomfort, and in many ways, it begins to expose our own vulnerabilities in relation to our understanding of the social world. Now, let's talk about the sociological imagination. And what the sociological imagination, according to C. Wright Mills, is this intersection between biography and history that not only help shape our understanding of the social world, but also begin to shape our understanding of ourself. It's a quality of mind that essentially promotes this relationship and this understanding of our individual circumstances and larger social forces. Well, that's textbook definition. So what does the sociological imagination actually mean? Well, the sociological imagination says, let's look at our personal troubles. Right? What are some of the issues you may be facing on a personal level in your everyday lives? Perhaps it's issues of poverty. Perhaps it's issues related to homelessness or food insecurity. Right? Perhaps for some of us, it may be student debt that we're concerned about. Joblessness, a wide variety of factors that we believe are affecting us on a personal level. And what C. Wright Mills tells us is that through the sociological imagination, understand that your personal troubles are not entirely your fault. That your personal troubles are actually a reflection of larger social issues, larger social ills. And that these personal troubles are not only influenced by these larger social issues, but in many ways, they're beyond your control. So let me give you an example of this. Think about the education system, particularly higher education in the United States. My background outside of teaching, or prior to teaching, at the tenure track full-time level, was a college counselor at a high school. And as a college counselor, I had to be cognizant of the fact that many of my students could not afford to go to a four-year university. So I had to develop strategies for directing my students to universities that were incredibly generous with scholarships, universities that were not that expensive, but were high quality. Well, I want you to think about that. Think about someone who's struggling with student debt. That student debt may be $20,000, and I've seen student debt for undergraduates as high as $150,000 to $200,000. Now, what you want to understand about student debt is that it carries with it anywhere between a 5.5% to 6.5% interest rate, assuming that the student has good credit or their parents have good credit. About a $90,000 loan will run you about $850 a month 10 years following your graduation from college. Imagine that $850 a month at about a $90,000 loan. Well, individuals are drowning in debt. Individuals are defaulting on their loans. Individuals are saying, look, I just can't survive if I pay my full loan amount. So it ruins their credit. It ruins their ability to qualify for future loans, perhaps for graduate school. It ruins their ability to purchase a home. All these factors impact that individual's life on a personal level. From a sociological imagination perspective, we can actually argue that the student debt bubble that continues to grow on an annual basis is actually a reflection of larger social issues. The fact that the United States has not invested heavily in higher education on the individual level. I want you to think about this. The Pell Grant, P-E-L-L, the grant that you may qualify for through FAFSA, that's around $6,000. Now, $6,000 to subsidize the education at a community college, yes, that will work. $6,000 to subsidize the education at a Cal State, well, you'll have to borrow about $1,000 or $2,000 or come out of pocket with $1,000 or $2,000. At the UC level, however, that's roughly about $13,000 for your education, and the Pell Grant only covers $6,000 of it. Now, of course, there's the Cal Grant and other scholarships, Blue and Gold Scholarship that you can qualify for. Well, let's strictly look at the Pell Grant. There's a deficit there of about $7,000, and we're only talking about tuition. We're not talking about books, food, or housing. Well, let's go a step further. What happens if you decide to go to USC? Now, prior to this new policy at USC, where essentially if you make less than $70,000 a year and you're admitted to USC, you can go to USC for free. But prior to this policy, let's say you didn't qualify for a tremendous amount of scholarships and USC costs $50,000 a year to go to. That Pell Grant, $6,000, barely makes a dent in your tuition. USC was not known for being the most generous university when it came to financial aid. So there's a possibility that you would have to borrow $25,000 a year for the next 4 years at $100,000. Well, we want to take that into consideration. The largest social problem is the fact that colleges and universities are becoming more expensive. Financial aid is not keeping up with this increased expense. And on the personal trouble side, struggling with that student debt. And then we can go a step further. As C. Wright Mills talks about, well, let's take into consideration your race or your ethnicity, your social class or socioeconomic standing, your gender, your faith, your religion, economics of the social world, economics of your country, the politics of your country. All of this will create a tremendous amount of stress. a tremendous amount of personal troubles. And we'll talk about all those factors later on because we do have chapters dedicated to each one of those. So we'll talk about that a little later. Now, what we want to understand through the sociological imagination is that essentially provides a very radical way of experiencing and interpreting our reality. Once again, saying that there are larger social issues that are affecting our everyday lives. And we want to keep that in mind. Now we're going to look at micro and macro sociology. And if you break down microsociology, macro sociology, micro means small, macro means large. And at the micro level, we're looking at a level of analysis of face-to-face interactions, of small group interactions, and how those interactions begin to shape larger structures within society. A little while ago, I talked about the Black Lives Matter movement beginning to shape policy, beginning to shape the behaviors and the policies of receptive law enforcement agencies. What happened at the face-to-face level, the small group level, and it grew into a movement that's increased its power and its influence. At the macro level, the impact of large social structures and how they begin to affect groups and individuals, going back to the example of Coca-Cola, going back to the example of large corporations that shape consumer behavior. Decisions are made at the top, they trickle down to the masses, and they seek to convince you that, hey, you want this product. There is some level of self-worth associated with wearing this brand of clothing, or social status associated with wearing this brand of clothing. And so we want to think about how that shapes us, especially perhaps in our middle school and high school years, where maybe at times the brand of clothing or the brand of shoes we're wearing does have an impact on how people interact with us. And then give us a breakdown basically of the chapters that we're going to be discussing within this class. We're going to be discussing society, culture, as we mentioned before, social institutions related to politics, education, and religion. We're going to look at social inequality, class, race, and gender. We're going to look at groups and group membership, the roles that we hold in our everyday social lives, the process of socialization. How did you become the person you are today? And how did your friends and acquaintances become the person they are? How we begin to interact with individuals through the process of what we call social mapping. And we'll talk about social mapping later on. And of course, perhaps one of the most important factors, our sense of self, right? How do we begin to develop that sense of self and our understanding of the social world? Now let's look at structural functionalism. And structural functionalism is one of the three major theories within sociology. It belongs under the category of macro-sociological theories. And structural functionalism is essentially this idea that our society is a unified whole that functions because of the contributions of separate structures. Think about society as the human body, made up of all these different organs. And these organs don't exist in isolation. They're interdependent and interrelated. And if one organ fails, it jeopardizes the entire operation of the rest of the human body. Well, society operates in a similar way. We have various social structures. We have various elements or components of society that need to interact correctly or function correctly in order for society to operate smoothly. So let's look at the alternative definition. Let's break away from the textbook definition of structural functionalism. Essentially, what the functionalist perspective is saying is that we have all of these interrelated, interdependent components or elements, each performing a specific function that contributes to society as a whole. Those different elements, those different components of society, well, those could be the family unit, our education system, our healthcare system, the criminal justice system, the overall economy. And within these institutions, we begin to understand social roles. We begin to understand group membership and cultures that are established within them. And the idea is that all of these cultures should contribute to society functioning smoothly through these different structures, through these different components. Now, what we want to take into consideration is that as we begin to understand structural functionalism, I want you to view it as the family influences the education system influences the criminal justice system, the criminal justice system, education system, and the family system influence the healthcare system, which influences the economy, and so on and so forth. Right? The idea that if the family structure fails, it can have an immediate impact on a young student's performance in school, a young student's behavior in school. This idea that within the family unit, we're not only socialized into a culture, we're also taught what is appropriate or inappropriate behavior, what is right and what is wrong. And think about that. If that is lacking and you transition to school, that can create some difficulties within school. If the school system can't reform you, if the school system can't socialize you to adhere to social policies, to adhere to social norms, well, perhaps the criminal justice system will get involved at some point. Now, A doesn't equal B 100% of the time. But when we do look at the criminal justice system and who's existing within the criminal justice system, we often see some shared characteristics. And those shared characteristics and background are typically a failed educational experience and at times issues within the family unit. And we'll go through that a little later on. Now, what are the main principles of functionalism? Well, society is conceived as stable, as an ordered system. Once again, structural functionalism, we're looking at, can we operate society in a smooth manner? This idea that each component, each element contributes to the continued stability and equilibrium of the unified whole. Now, that's not to say that there aren't issues of dysfunction within structural functionalism. There can be dysfunctions at any point within these components, within these elements, that can jeopardize this equilibrium. A society that is operating and functioning correctly can identify these dysfunctions, can view these dysfunctions as areas of growth, and adapt and to change to meet these dysfunctions, right? To strengthen the cohesiveness of these social structures. But at times, dysfunctions can provide undesirable results, undesirable consequences. Think about right now, the reason why we're online, COVID-19. COVID-19 has highlighted dysfunctions within our political system, particularly our leadership. It has identified dysfunctions in relation to healthcare and people's access to healthcare. And it's also identified a growing culture, unfortunately, of individuals who are learning or who have been taught, who have been influenced to ignore the advice of medical professionals, researchers, and scientists. Well, that's a dysfunction that is having tremendous impacts on our society. Think about it. A breakdown in health and well-being in our country has jeopardized the family units, right? Has jeopardized individuals' ability to function normally within our society without having to wear a mask, without having to be consumed with washing our hands. Think about the impact it's had on our education system, right? Distance ed, distance learning, as well as our financial systems, right? The idea that tens of millions of Americans are unemployed. The idea that the government has had to offer additional government subsidies The idea that individuals don't know if they're going to be able to afford their rent or their mortgage in the not so far future, right? These are all dysfunctions of a system that can all be related to obviously a healthcare crisis, but also a breakdown in leadership. Now, under macro sociology, under structural functionalism, we have Emil Durkheim. And Durkheim in 1893 starts to argue that society is held together through different types of bonds that maintain social order, that maintain stability. Durkheim says there is a continuum that exists within societies of simple societies and complex societies. And when we use the term simple societies, we're referring to pre-modern societies, societies that have typically existed outside of the realm of the Industrial Revolution, outside of the realm of capitalism. And we can attribute these simple societies or these pre-modern societies to this concept of what we call mechanical solidarity. Mechanical solidarity is essentially the glue that holds society together through shared beliefs, values, and traditions. This idea that we think similarly in pre-modern simple societies, we understand the emotional bonds that we have with one another. So in simple societies, let's view it in this way. You're going to fetch the water. You're going to raise the children. You're going to be our protector, our warrior. You're going to be the hunter. You're going to make clothing, etc. And all of us know our roles. Now, we may not be happy or thrilled with the roles that we've been assigned, but we understand if I drop the ball, it's going to have a negative impact on our survival as a group. That's where this interpersonal interaction takes place, where this sense of community takes place, right? The glue that holds us together. We have this shared belief that I need to do A, B, and C in order for our society, in order for our community to thrive, to exist. And that's mechanical solidarity. On the other hand, you have organic solidarity. And organic solidarity is essentially this idea that our society is not simple. Our society is complex. Modern societies today are complex and what we call divisions of labor. That's not as simple as you fetch water, you care for the kids, you make clothing, you hunt, you serve as a warrior. It's not that simple, according to Durkheim, when it comes to organic solidarity. Durkheim argues that organic solidarity is actually, there's an interdependence, but this interdependence is not framed on the basis of emotional ties. This interdependence is framed on this concept of, I need you for as long as I need you, and when I no longer need you, goodbye. Think about it this way. You start to have car issues, you take it to the mechanic. Do you have emotional bonds with that mechanic? No. You interact with that mechanic for the purpose of having your car repaired. The mechanic interacts with you not only to repair your car, but also to be compensated. And at the end of that business transaction, you go your separate ways. You're probably not inviting them over for Christmas dinner or Thanksgiving dinner. And your interaction with your mechanic probably doesn't exist again until your car needs to be serviced again. And that's what organic solidarity is essentially saying, is that we have these, yes, we have these interdependent tasks, but these interdependent tasks are based on our needs. They're not based on interpersonal relationships. They're not based on emotional ties to one another. Now, we'll skip this particular slide and we'll go to the next slide because we already covered what was on the previous slide. We look at Merton in 1968. And this is still under the umbrella of macro sociology. This is still under the umbrella of structural functionalism. And what Merton argues, is that essentially within our society, within social structures, and within our life experiences, we have what we call manifest and latent functions. Manifest functions are essentially the intended consequences of some action or social process. what we intend to see, what we expect the result to be. And then latent functions are the unintended consequences. So let me give you an example of this. The manifest function of taking an introduction to sociology class at Rio Hondo College is fairly simple. We're taking this class to fulfill the IGETSI requirements under the social and behavioral sciences, where you need to take 3 courses. You want to earn credit for this class so that you're awarded the 3 units, so that you can use those units towards a certificate or a degree and hopefully transfer to a 4-year university. That's the manifest function. That's the intended consequence. Now, what's the unintended consequence of being in this class or being enrolled in a college or university for the next 2 to 4 years? Well, the unintended consequences are the stress that you're going to endure, right? Worried about your classes, the amount of sleep that you're losing out on during summer break, being in a class at 8 in the morning, the amount of sleep that you're going to lose studying for your classes, and also think about the money that you're not earning by being in class and not working. Those are the unintended consequences of pursuing higher education. Now, I would say the sacrifice is worth it because your earning potential increases dramatically or drastically later on. You make a sacrifice for a few years to increase that earning potential. But in the immediate, right, the latent function is you are making sacrifices that you may not necessarily always identify as sacrifices. Another latent function of higher education is the fact that students go to school, right? They may rack up all this student debt. The debt doesn't seem real to you while you're taking out this loan for $15,000, $20,000, $30,000 a year until you have to pay it back starting 6 months after graduation. That's also an unintended consequence at times. Now, another concept or major sociological theory under the umbrella of macrosociology is conflict theory. And conflict theory, and I'll read you the textbook definition, is a paradigm that sees social conflict as the basis of society and social change, and that emphasizes a materialist view of society, a critical way of viewing the status quo, and a dynamic model of historical change. So what does that mean? Conflict theory is essentially saying that within our society, we can expect conflict. Within society, you are going to have those individuals who benefit, and you are going to have those individuals who are consistently forgotten or screwed over. Conflict theory highlights this focus on social inequality. Social inequality being the unequal distribution of wealth, of power, of prestige, and influence within our society. This idea that those at the very top, the 1%, those who are able to purchase political influence, have a louder voice in the policies that are created at times than those who are the forgotten masses. Those individuals who are of poverty-stricken backgrounds, who are in the working class, who are oftentimes overlooked by our government, who are oftentimes forgotten by our society. Now, we can go a step further when we define conflict theory. And Karl Marx, as many of you probably already know, Karl Marx is the godfather of communism, but he's also the godfather of conflict theory. And what conflict theorists argue is that there's an inevitable experience of coercion, domination, conflict, and change within society. That you have these groups that are struggling to attain limited or scarce societal resources that we deem to be valuable. And as I mentioned before, wealth, money, power, prestige, authority. That there's this constant tug of war, this constant battle. And we're going to see that right now through the teachings of Karl Marx. Karl Marx talked about how there were 2 distinct social classes, the haves and the have-nots, the workers and the business owners, the proletariat being the working class and the bourgeoisie being the ruling class. And what Karl Marx essentially says is that the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, are going to exploit the labor of the proletariat, that they're going to try to get every ounce of labor, every dollar that they possibly could squeeze out of you to maximize their wealth. But at what cost to the proletariat? At what cost to the working class? I want you to think about your own experiences working. When I was in college, I worked at Sears, I worked at Best Buy, I worked at Subway, I worked at a variety of different places. And I was a good salesman when it came to selling electronics. I did that at Sears and Best Buy. And I would have managers that would say, hey, you know, at Best Buy, you're bringing in about 5,000 to 10,000, maybe more than that, depending on the day. Roughly about $10,000 average, though, every shift that you work. Right, you're selling a lot of TVs. This is back in the day when plasma and LCD TVs were very, very expensive. When a Blu-ray player was $500, when HDMI cables were like $100. And they would tell me, well, I need you to sell more. It was always, I need you to sell more. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm selling like $10,000 in 6 hours. Right, that's pretty good. And they said, you know, if you sell more, we're going to take care of you come evaluation time. And I said, okay, cool. You know, thinking that, okay, I'm going to get promoted. I'm going to get a raise of like $5. So they squeezed all my labor out of me. I hustled and I hustled and I hustled to upsell consumers, right? To upsell customers to say, hey, you need this power surge protector, not the $20 one, you need the $100 one. And come evaluation time, were my efforts rewarded? Well, you could argue to a degree, but not really, because I got a 23-cent raise. And some of us have probably had a similar experience where we worked our butts off and then we're rewarded with pennies on the dollar. Well, that's essentially what the bourgeoisie do to the proletariat. Karl Marx says, hey, the workers, through this exploitation of their labor, they're alienated from their work. And let me explain what that means. So I smoke cigars, and hopefully everyone can see this. Let me see if I can pull up my screen a little large. Yeah. So this is a travel humidor, right? It keeps your cigars fresh. And so when I go to cigar lounges, I typically put my cigars in here just to make sure they don't dry out or anything of that sort. And so this humidor has alligator skin, or this portable humidor has alligator skin. And I don't know, I got it at some event, so I don't know what it's worth. So let me make up a value. Let's say I make travel humidors for a living. And I create this humidor, and let's say I sell it for $150. That's the materials, that's my labor. I'm sorry, yeah, about $150. And in materials and labor, it costs me $50 to make, which means that I'm making $100 profit. Well, if I was not alienated from my labor, I myself, as the sole manufacturer of this travel humidor, would reap the benefits of my hard work. I'd make $100 profit. But what happens with the alienation of labor is that now I work for someone. They're telling me you have to make 10 travel humidors a day. And it's going to cost us $50 to produce with your labor and materials. We're going to sell it for $150, but you're not going to see any of the $100 profit. We're going to keep that $100 profit times 10, right? We're looking at $1,000 profit, and I haven't seen anything. My hourly wage remains at $12, $13, $14 an hour. That's the alienation of labor. You have stripped me of my rights to the benefits associated with selling this particular travel humidor. And what Karl Marx highlights between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat is the bourgeoisie are not only trying to squeeze every ounce of labor out of you and to pay you the least amounts, but they're going to consistently try to lower their labor costs, which means that for some of us, we may be in jobs where there's downsizing taking place, where we're working in these jobs but we're now performing the duties of 2 or 3 individuals, as opposed to the initial duties that were written in the job description when we were initially hired. And so I want you to think about that. You may get a small raise, right? You may get a stipend associated with performing those duties, but it still doesn't justify all the additional responsibilities that you're taking on in your job. Now, Karl Marx also talks about the struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat never reaching a consensus, that the differences were too great, because if they were to reach some type of consensus, if they were to reconcile their differences, well, one group would benefit and another group would lose. And the group that would benefit would be essentially the bourgeoisie, that the proletariat will continue to be screwed over. And so you want to keep that in mind in relation to today's society. Karl Marx also argues that the wealthy and the powerful bourgeoisie are going to use every tool at their disposal to exploit the labor of the proletariat, that they're going to use the government, the states, that they're going to use the education system to socialize students to follow the rules. Think about it. When you're in elementary school, the socialization process of being an elementary school student, line up on that yellow line. Raise your hand when you need to use the bathroom. Raise your hand when you have to ask a question. He talked about religion being used as a way to oppress individuals, that religion taught us to grow satisfied with our social positions, to not seek change to the existing system. We actually see this during the time of slavery, that slave owners would manipulate the teachings of the Bible to promote a message that essentially said that slaves had to be loyal to their masters. They exploited the word of their faith, they exploited the word of the Bible in order to gain loyalty, in order to convince individuals not to seek social change. And so let's start to go through conflict theory a little bit further. What Karl Marx and conflict theory discuss is this idea that to maintain their power, the bourgeoisie promoted an ideology, a system of beliefs, attitudes, and values that in many ways directs society and constantly reproduce the status quo, right? That's in their favor, of course. And the way we're socialized in society is to adopt the prevailing ideology of the bourgeoisie, right? That their ideology does not represent the realities of our social lives or the social lives of the masses, but instead represents the realities of the social lives of the bourgeoisie. And we develop this false consciousness. And this false consciousness is essentially this brainwashing that takes place, that the oppressed begin to adopt the interests and the ideology of the dominant class, of the ruling class, of the bourgeoisie. It's this idea of the carrot that dangles in front of our nose. If you've ever been at Knott's Berry Farm and on the stagecoach ride at Knott's Berry Farm, you'll notice that the horses have blinders on so that they can only look straight. That's essentially what false consciousness does. It tells us, hey, here's this carrot dangling in front of your nose. Just follow the carrot, just follow the carrot, just follow the carrot. Ignore and be blind to everything that's happening around you. And then when you become, complacent, right? When you become blinded from the realities of the situation, well, the bourgeoisie have won. And if you start asking questions, well, what we'll let you do is we'll let you take a little bite of that carrot, and then we're going to move it forward and further away from you. So you're constantly chasing these unattainable goals, right? These unattainable goals that have been established by the bourgeoisie. This idea that they want to give you a taste of what it means to be part of their club without ever allowing you into their club. And so I want you to think about that. Class consciousness, on the other hand, is the state of being woke, right? The state of recognizing social inequality, understanding that oppression does exist within our society. And with this class consciousness, what essentially happens is that we start to say, you know what, the system is broken. We need to change this flawed system in order to develop a more equitable society. And so I want you to take that into consideration as we go through this course. This class consciousness is essentially what sociology accomplishes. This idea of exposing the realities of the situation at hand. Now, we're going to cross over to the last major sociological theory, symbolic interactionism. And this falls into the category of microsociology because it focuses on more immediate, more personal interactions, right? And symbolic interactionism, from the perspective of the textbook, is a paradigm that sees interaction and meaning as central to society and assumes that meanings are not inherent but are created through social interaction. So what essentially does that mean? How do we begin to interact with individuals, and how do we begin to associate meaning to those interactions? This idea that our social interactions begin to shape our understanding of the social world, and through our life experiences, we begin to define the value and the meaning of those social interactions. So let me give you an example of situations. If we're in a face-to-face environment and you walk into the classroom and I'm talking to a student, and I tell the student, yeah, let's definitely link up for a drink after class. Well, how might that be interpreted? First, you may say, wow, my professor's asking that female student out for a drink after class. Is that appropriate? And now you're probably going to be looking at my interaction with that student and other female students, right? Saying, wow, okay, I see how this professor gets down. When in reality, from my perspective and the perspective of the student, we were talking about going to the Rio Cafe to go have a Starbucks drink because the student needed to interview me for a project that she is doing for her class. See, our life experiences, our interactions within the social world are open to multiple meanings, and we want to keep that in mind. If you send me a text in all caps, I'm going to read it as, okay, well, clearly someone does not know how to turn off their caps lock on their cell phone keyboard. Another individual might say, hey, this person must be upset, right? This person's trying to make their point known. Or we can even go as far as emojis. Think about the meanings of emojis, right? The eggplant emoji and what that means, right? I teach human sexuality as well, so we break down emojis in my human sexuality class. But I want you to think about that, right? The different meanings that are associated with our interactions, right? The idea that something may mean something that I say, something that I do may mean something to me in a certain manner or in a certain way, will may mean something entirely different to someone else in their interpretation. Now, through these interactions, our groups, our organizations, our society as a whole are created, maintained, and changed. We do need to have a degree of uniformity present, right? We do need to have basic understandings of social interactions. We do need to have basic understandings of our social worlds so that we can have a consistent interpretation and defining moment of other people's behaviors. And we'll break this down a little later as well. I want you to think about the power of symbols and how we begin to interpret symbols and the meaning of symbols. If you look at the slide, you see the cross. Right? To one group of individuals, this cross may be interpreted as salvation, forgiveness, right? Love, compassion, caring for others, sacrifice. For other individuals, they may view it from a historical perspective as this cross led to the destruction of my culture. this cross led to the destruction of my belief system. When we talk about race and ethnicity later on, we're going to talk about the Native American community and how Native American youth, late 1800s, early 1900s, were forced into these schools that essentially sought to force assimilation upon them, to teach them Christianity as the only faith system. And how children were starved, how children were beaten, how children were forced to abandon everything about their culture in a way to assimilate into American culture without ever being treated as being truly American. And we'll discuss that later on. How about the Golden Arches? What type of meaning might be associated with that? When I see the Golden Arches, I'm thinking about 2 meat patties, special sauce, cheese, lettuce, onions, tomato. I'm sorry, not tomato, pickles on a sesame seed bun. Right? The Big Mac. Other individuals may look at the Golden Arches and say, well, that's a roadmap to diabetes. Right? That's a roadmap to obesity. Right? That's a roadmap to mom and pop burger joints being run out of business by large corporations. The McDonald's sign is one of the most recognizable symbols within our society. Right? And you want to keep that in mind as we go through this. Think about what a symbol represents and how, depending on the social situation, depending at the point in time that it's in existence or being used, can carry with it multiple meanings. Let's look at this, the swastika. Adolf Hitler, the extermination of millions of people, the idea of the development of the master race. Right? Well, I want you to think about Adolf Hitler and the swastika. Did he create the swastika? No. He exploited the swastika to push his political fascist movement. The swastika was actually in existence many years prior to Hitler. The swastika is one of the most profound and one of the oldest symbols. It dates back more than 2,500 years. It stands for well-being and good fortune, clearly not the same meaning that the Nazis associated with it. This idea of constantly trying to better yourself, this boundless morality associated with Buddhism. Well, I want you to think about that. I had the opportunity a few years back to go on a speaking tour in China for 2 weeks. And I pretty much outlined China and went to about 11 or 12 different provinces. And when I was out there, I made it a point to visit multiple Buddhist temples. And these Buddhist temples are hundreds and hundreds of years old. And as I'm walking through the Buddhist temples, right, you see the swastika carved into the forehead or the chest of Buddha, or the different statues that were present. And knowing my history, right, I understood what the swastika meant on these Buddhist statues, but I couldn't help but think about, how about those individuals who don't have a strong sense of history or knowledge of history? Are they thinking to themselves, oh man, I didn't know the Nazis occupied China as well? We want to keep that in mind, that what people say, what people do, the symbols that are being used can hold with it multiple interpretations. Now, the last slide that we're going to go over is this idea that we begin to use symbols so that we could attach meaning so that it's easier to understand. And this meaning associated with symbols begins to shape and create our social world, right? It begins to shape how we respond to individuals, as I mentioned with brands, right? If we fall victim to a materialistic society, we may view a person driving a Bentley or a Rolls Royce at times as more valuable than the individual driving a beat up, Honda Civic. Think about how we display wealth. Wow, that person is wealthy, therefore they must be smarter, they must be a hard worker. That's not necessarily true. I know plenty of people, I'm sure you know plenty of people who are incredibly brilliant, who work incredibly hard every day. but maybe didn't get that lucky break. And so we're going to talk about how we're socialized into those narratives that begin to, in many ways, manipulate our ways of thinking later on. So let me stop sharing the screen. And let me... Now, my question to everyone is, does anyone have any questions related to this chapter? If you do, feel free to unmute yourself and I can answer any questions that you may have.